Recording started.
Okay, so welcome once again to everybody from all over the world. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm just going to take you through, as I said, the main stages of the webinar so that you can really maximize what your experience of the webinar is going to be before I hand over to John Hurd, who you've come to listen to today. But I will be staying online and I'll be here just to support you, and if you've got any questions, if you're having any troubles, please do let me know. One thing I would like to say before we start is some people sometimes have difficulty with the sound, and I think that's something to do with Blackboard as a software program. If anybody has headphones to hand, could I please encourage you to use them, because it really does make a big difference. So I just wanted to throw that helpful hint out there. If you don't, the sound shouldn't be a problem, but I think it's just if you do have headphones to hand, then please do feel free to use them because they do help. So as I said, I'm just going to take you through the main points of the webinar platform, and I'm just going to start with the video and audio window, which is where you can see me and how you're hearing me, obviously. And this is where John will appear when he comes to give his presentation. Next is the chat box, which most of you seem to have found. And the chat box is really there for your benefit so that you can interact with us and also with each other and bounce ideas off each other and chat to each other, let us know that you're following okay. It's really there for you, and it reassures us that you're following everything and that we're not just talking to ourselves. I know that that John and myself will be reading it as well, so please do make use of the chat box. The third area is this whiteboard presentation window, which is where the main content of this presentation will be. So along with John's voice, you should really be focusing the majority of your attention here. And then the fourth and final area is the participant window, which I'm just going to take you through in a little bit more detail now. Okay, so in your participant area, you will notice that there are 4 icons. If you hover over the first, you'll see that there are a range of emoticons that come up. And you can click on those just to let us know how you're feeling. I think there are a couple of on there that say whether you would like us to speed up or slow down. But a little bit like the chat box, it's really there for your benefit and for you to sort of let us know how you're getting on. The second one is like the Be Right Back button. So if you need to step away from the webinar at any point, just click on the button and that lets us know that you've stepped out of the room. And then when you're ready to come back, just click on that again and that lets us know that you are back with us. This third button here is a little hand, and it basically means raise your hand. So your presenter might ask you during the course of the presentation to raise your hand in answer to a question. So I'm going to say to you now, please raise your hand if everything is clear so far. That's great. Okay, I think most people have managed to find that okay, which is lovely. And then to lower your hand, you just click on that button again. And if I could ask everybody now to please lower their hands, it just saves us having to make sure that we're giving you our attention, because if you leave your hand raised, then we tend to think that you might want to ask us something. So if you could please all lower your hands now, that would be lovely. And I know that we won't be using this button today, but I'm just going to tell you about it in case you need it for future webinars. This is what we call our polling button, and it's usually used in response to a multiple choice question. So it might either be a yes or no answer, or it might be an A, B, C, D, or E answer. And this is what it would look like if you were asked one of those questions. So that's just the polling button, and if you're asked to use it in response to a question, please do use that polling button, because that allows us to publish answers so that we can see how many people have answered what. But as I said, I know that you won't be needing to use that one today. So just a couple more things to say about chat box. If you want to make your chat box bigger, you can press and hold on this bit of the bar here and drag it into the middle of the screen, and then just using the corners as you would any computer window, you can just drag it to make it bigger or smaller, and then you can see more of the text. If the font size is a little bit small for you, just press on this little drop-down menu here and it'll come up with increase font size, and then you can decrease it if you find that it's too big. If you're finding that the chat box is a little bit distracting, because with so many people in the room, and I can see that there are 84 of us at the moment, it can move quite quickly. So if you're finding that it's just a little bit too much to try and keep track of that as well as listen to the presentation and you're losing focus a bit, you can minimize the chat box by clicking on this downwards arrow, and that'll just hide it for you. And then if you want to contribute to the discussion, or if you want to come back into the room and make a comment, just put that back up. That little arrow will be pointing upwards. Just click on it again, and then it'll come back up onto your full screen, and you'll be able to see the conversations again. Okay, this is for the benefit of anybody who's joining us from a mobile device, so either a phone or tablet. This is what your screen will look like. You won't have the presenter video shot because it doesn't have that facility, unfortunately. But it's not the end of the world, because the most important thing is that you can hear and you can see the actual presentation. If you want to make your screen full size, you can just click on that button there, and that will extend the size of the whiteboard so that it takes up the whole screen, and your 4 icons will just hover over the top. Okay, so just a few notes about questions. I know that John is going to do his best to keep an eye on the chat box as we go through and answer any questions that you might have along the way. But if we do miss anything, please feel free to type them in again, and I'll do my best to pick them up, and then we'll have a look at them a bit later on in the webinar. And of course, there will be some time at the end for questions and answers. So the only thing left for me to say before I hand you over to John, who you've actually come to listen to, is that you will be receiving a follow-up email in the next couple of days, and in that email there'll be a link to the recording of this webinar. There'll be a request for your feedback, and I really do encourage you to answer that feedback, please. Just take 5 minutes. It's a very quick survey, but it just lets us know what you think of the webinar platform, whether you think it was a good experience, what you took away from it, and also just in regards to content, it's making sure that we're delivering webinars that you find relevant, and they're there for your benefit. So if you could please just take the 5 minutes to fill out the feedback, that would be really, really great. And also in your follow-up email there'll be a summary handout and a certificate of attendance. If for any reason you don't receive that email, I'm going to pop in an email address at the end of the webinar, but the email address is professionaldevelopmentservices@oup.com. And if you just pop them an email and say, I didn't get my follow-up email, and they'll be able to forward that on for you. So unless anybody has any questions about the webinar platform for me right now, I will hand you over to John, who has come to give you the presentation today. Enjoy.
Okay, everybody. Firstly, can you hear me okay? Just write a yes in the chat box if you can hear me. Fantastic. Is the sound quality okay? Okay, and can you now see me? Okay, fantastic, good. Okay, thanks, Kate. If the sound does disappear, which occasionally happens, please just write something in the chat box and I'll try and adjust it. I have a microphone in front of me, as you can see, so I may need to readjust it from time to time. Okay, welcome everybody. Nice to see people from a range of countries, a range of places. Nice to see a few of my friends out there as well, so hi to everybody. As Kate said, if you have any comments or questions, you can put them in the chat box as we go through. I will do my best to keep an eye on them, and I will do my best to respond if at all I can. So please feel free to do that, and we can also maybe have a bit of time at the end for a question and answer session. Okay, so are we ready for a little bit of grammar? Do I see any yeses? There will be a link to watch it again, yes. Good, yes, okay, fantastic. Okay, let's begin. To begin with, I'm just going to put a few questions up. And I'd just like you to spend maybe 1 minute just thinking about these questions, just to get us in sort of a grammar mode, a grammar mood. So if you'd like to just think about these, I'll leave you in silence just for a little while to think about these, and then we can maybe share some ideas. Okay, the question, how do you teach grammar? That's a big question. I don't think we can discuss that at the moment in this platform. Depends on the knowledge of students. Yes, I think a lot of things that we're going to talk about will be, it depends. Okay, we're moving on to the deductive, inductively. Let's just pull back from that for a minute. Just to get a snapshot, could you just put the name in the chat box of any materials you use, any course books you use, or grammar books that you use? Yeah, could we just put some in, just so we get a snapshot? Reward, yes. Murphy, English Plus, Murphy. Okay, what about course books? Course books, we've had Reward in there as a course book. English Plus, I think I saw. New English File. Okay, Business Results, Solutions. Okay, a nice range. Okay, and as for grammar books, I saw Murphy mentioned a few times. Any grammar books that you tend to use, or you tend to refer to? English Grammar in Use, Murphy, Oxford Grammar, Hermer, I don't know that one, I'm afraid. Okay. Yes. When later in the talk we'll be referring to books, we'll be referring more to course books in their approach to teaching grammar. A lot of the grammar practice books are very deductive in that they are essentially for consolidation, for review, as well as for input, but they mainly give the rules, don't they? So when we're referring to books later, we'll be talking more about course books. Do any of you produce your own materials, your own grammar materials? Could we just have a quick yes or no? Yes, no. A few no's, more yeses, that's great. Sometimes, okay, I guess a sometimes is a yes, isn't it? Sometimes. Okay. And what approach does the material take? Now, again, that's another big question. So we'll sort of move on from that and move on to the topic of today: deductive v. inductive. Deductive and or inductive grammar teaching. How many of you are familiar with these terms? And how many of you know what they mean? I am not familiar. Yes. Cautious. Okay. Not sure. Okay. So some of you are, some of you aren't. In a word, what's the difference? Or maybe not in a word, in 2 or 3 words, in the shortest sense you can, what's the difference between deductive and inductive? Can anybody throw that out there? Rules given, rules first. Yes, the way we learn, teaching, noticing. Okay. Yes, so some of you have actually given the explanation of deductive. 1 or 2 of you mentioned inductive as well. Okay, so great. Some of you are familiar with these approaches to teaching. Hopefully today it'll give you a bit more food for thought. It'll maybe give you a few things to think about. Will maybe consolidate your already understanding. Maybe you will have some ideas that you can put in the chat box that we can all find interesting and useful and maybe learn from. So what we're going to do is basically look at what is deductive and inductive grammar teaching, and we are going to look at the underlying principles to begin with of deductive and inductive reasoning. We'll then look at how that applies to grammar teaching and how these deductive and inductive approaches to teaching grammar are drawing on the underlying principles. We will then move on and look at some considerations and look at the pros and cons, and we'll see if we can draw a conclusion. Now, I'll just digress for a moment. My final slide, or my penultimate slide, is by someone who's in this room at the moment, Branka. And Branka just informed me she can't stay to the end, so I'm sorry that you won't see your slide, Branka. But if you can get a recording, you'll be able to see it there. Okay, so the underlying principles. Deductive reasoning, inductive reasoning. Deductive reasoning is where we go from the more general to the more specific, in broad summary. And this is not just with grammar teaching, this is the principle of deductive reasoning which has is involved in philosophy, the sciences, the arts, etc., etc. You go from the more general to the more specific. Let's hone in on that a bit more. You start off with a broad theory, a general theory. You then narrow this down to specific hypotheses, which you can then test. Okay, so this is one approach of reasoning. It's a top-down approach, from the broader to the more narrow. Okay. Conversely, inductive reasoning is from the more specific to the more general. Inductive reasoning, in the broad sense, in all the disciplines, is where you start off with specific observations through which you can maybe detect patterns. You then formulate hypotheses, developing conclusions. So often with deductive and inductive, you end up perhaps in the same place, with conclusions, with rules, with laws that you can test. But the process is, deductive is more of a top-down, inductive is more bottom-up, starting from the small to the bigger, deductive from the bigger to the smaller. That's essentially deductive reasoning. So in summary, general to specific, specific to general. So this is the reasoning in which inductive and deductive grammar teaching, among other things, is grounded. So, deductive and inductive grammar teaching, a few of you put a few ideas out there. What is it? And yes, it follows these same principles. Deductive, essentially, is when we give the rule. That's the generalization. We start with the generalization. We give the rule. Inductive, conversely, you're welcome, Nico. Inductive, conversely, is when, anybody like to fill in my next sentence? Deductive is when we give the rule. Inductive is when we... Is anybody going to type anything before I press forward? Produce, find the rule, deduce the rule. Yes, interesting. Inductive is when we deduce the rule. Daniela, that's your comment. Now that used to confuse me when I first started teaching, and I used to think that deductive logically would be when you deduce the rule. And it did confuse me for a while. Until somebody said to me, you sort of induce the rule out of them. And then it all became clear to me. But interesting that you use deduce the rule to describe inductive. Let's use a phrasal verb. You work out the rule. You find the rule. You discover the rule. And I think when I started teaching, we talked about guided discovery. I don't know whether any of you are familiar with the term guided discovery. I think that's very similar to inductive learning. Okay, so that's broadly, and those of you who know me know I'm a huge fan of Scott Thornbury. I'm sure some of you out there are big fans of Scott Thornbury. If you're interested in grammar, Scott Thornbury is a must. He's a great read. He's got a great take on grammar. And I'll just leave you to read that for a few seconds. This is in his How to Teach Grammar. This is his explanation. He uses the term from which a rule is inferred. Yeah, this is from How to Teach Grammar, but Natural Grammar is another very good book of Scott Thornbury's. Okay. So if we go back to the box that we looked at a few minutes ago, in a context of grammar teaching, a generalization or rule, you then move to specific examples, specific activities, which are the very familiar to most of us grammar practice exercises. And in a way, you're testing, does this rule work? Can I apply this rule? Inductive, you start off with specific examples. It could be text, or it could be isolated examples. You do activities which leads you to produce the generalization and the rule. So again, general to specific, specific to general. Okay, let's go inside this a little bit more and look at the 4 I's. I think the 4 I's were originally 3 I's by McCarthy and Carter et al. In the 1990s. And they looked at this stage of inductive learning They originally said they were 3 stages. We now think of there are 4 stages, and each stage begins with I. Would anyone like to, in the chat box, have a guess, or maybe you know, what are some or all of these 4 stages of inductive learning? Each stage begins with I, very conveniently. I'll give you a hint in a moment. I will induce it from you in a moment. Introduction, Zana. Yes, but they don't use the term introduction, but it means, I presume you mean presenting the language. Illustrate, illustration, Stephen, yes, Ekaterina, excellent. Stage 1 of the I's is illustration. Illustration basically means giving salient input, giving the students the language, which illustrates the grammar. Induction is actually the 4th stage. Induction is the term we use for when you produce the rule. Inference, yes, inference isn't one of the I's, perhaps it should be. Yep. So we've got the illustration at the beginning, induction at the end, 2 I's in the middle. Identification, it isn't one of the I's, but it possibly could be. Okay. Shall I put you out of encouraging with an I? Yes. Okay. Although, Hannah, you're quite close, actually. I think you've got the 3rd I, sort of. Okay. I will try and induce them out of you a bit more. Can you now put down the 4 I's? Yeah, we've got them all. Well done. Okay. Excellent. Illustration, interaction, intervention, induction. And as I said, McCarthy and Carter, I think, came with 3. A 4th one was added by some more linguist academics a bit later on. Okay, so what are these 4 I's? They're probably what we do in the classroom. Any of us that teach inductively, we probably do this. We maybe haven't identified them in terms of these overt stages, but illustration, salient input. Input in which the grammar that we're going to focus on is easily and clearly identifiable and easily and clearly presented. That's the illustration, an illustration of the grammar. Interaction is the learner interacting with the language, noticing the patterns, okay, making inferences, developing the notion. Intervention, hints and guidance. This could be intervention by the teacher, nudging the learners along, a bit like I did when I gave you the parts of the words. In the course books, intervention is where you get these guided, scaffolded exercises which lead you to producing the rule. Okay? And the 4th stage, induction, is actually the production of the rule or the inference of the rule. Okay, so let's just look at that in a different way. So learners are presented with examples of language exponents. I am a huge fan of, as much as possible, giving students real examples. We often have to temper the language, simplify the language. I don't know whether this term is still used, but a while ago the term shelter. We used to talk about sheltered text. It wasn't really adapted, it was sheltered, just to make life a bit easy for them. But where possible, real examples of the language. Learners notice how it's used. They determine the rule. We, or the book, can explain, check the rules. I'm liking it, McDonald's, I can see that there, yes. That would be a nice little bit of inductive learning, wouldn't it? Real language. Then they do the practice exercises. Okay, so that's sort of going inside a little bit with the 4 I's of the process. Okay, we're now going to just do a little bit of inductive learning ourselves, or a bit of inductive consolidation. Whoops, I've just lost the screen. Still, okay, we can present language to our learners in a number of ways. It can be text. It can be isolated sentences, it can be short paragraphs, it can be a number of texts, or it can be, we can present things using a corpus, which we're going to look at in a moment. But before we do that, what is the meaning and use of the word still? it has a number of uses, but what to you is the first thing that comes to mind? If I said to you, what does still mean? How do we use still? Could you just put in the chat box, see how many different uses? Stand still, okay, being motionless. However, yes, similar to however, not moving, okay. Not moving. Continue something. Okay, steady, yet. I'm still here. Yes, continuing, I suppose. Continues to be the case. Yet. Motionless. Okay, so we've got quite a range of ideas here. Okay, we'll just do a little exercise, if you like. This is the sort of thing I do this actual exercise with my students at the university. I forgot to mention, as well as being a trainer, I'm also a writer and author. I also teach at the University of Oxford, and this is something that I actually do with my students. I'm going to give you a little corpus extract, which is some examples of real language. What I would like you to do, I'm going to leave you for a minute or two, and I would like you to see how many different uses of still you can find, and just see if you can produce an explanation for the meaning and use of these different uses. Okay, if you've got a piece of paper, you could jot them down. If you haven't, maybe you can just store them in your memories. So here is a corpus extract. This is all real language. There are a few different uses of still. Can you jot down as many as you can? I'll leave you to do that for a minute or so, or a minute or two, let's say, and then we'll come back together. Okay, let me interrupt you there. How many? First, let's talk numbers. How many different meanings, uses of still did you find? Hannah, 5. Would anyone like 4, 5? Many? Yeah, so we're coming out at 4 or 5. 5 seems to be winning at the moment. I don't actually know. We'll have a look in a moment and count them. 4, 5, yes. I mean, it could be an either or, because maybe one use, is it a distinctly different use or not? Okay, and can you put down any different uses that you have identified here? I still love it. Motionless, motionless. Yes, you have to stand still during the ceremony. Okay. Adjective, noun, adverb. Okay, that's grammar speak, but let's look at the meanings perhaps. Even, if something happened. Yes, even. Now we tend to teach, Christina mentioned even. We tend to use even with adjectives. Or maybe you don't mean with adjectives. We'll come back to that in a minute, actually. Even if something is true, Christina, yes. We can maybe just drill down to the meaning a little more than that. Silent, yes, I think there's an example of where it sort of means motionless in a sort of metaphoric, figurative sense. Okay. In process, motionless. So far active, yes, the still active volcano. That's quite an interesting use, isn't it? And we have another example similar, the still missing cockpit voice recorder. That use of still, I'm pretty sure, is probably not part of the standard ELT syllabus. For higher levels, a useful piece of language to be aware of. Still plus comparative. Yes, Robert, what example do we have of still plus comparative? I'm just looking for one here. It's still better than watching paint dry. Okay. There's probably one or two more examples. Yep. And in fact, there's another example with an adjective. It could be higher still. Okay. So what we've been doing here is a bit of inductive learning. If we go back to the model, we started, the illustration was presenting you with some language, real language in context. The interaction, you started looking and noticing. The intervention, I sort of guided you a little bit, or I could have guided you more, or if it was in the classroom, you could guide the students a little bit more. And then the induction, we were producing a few rules. So that's one example of how inductive learning could work. I'm a big fan of using corpora. I use them in a number of ways, and this is one way. It works great for those little words, those little adverby words, still, even, yet, just, and so on and so on. If you look at them in a corpus, you can see a whole range of uses, and it gives a good idea of how we use these words that are often difficult to explain. Okay, there's a lot on this slide, but this is a sort of summary that I might produce, or I would perhaps lead the learners to, for higher level learners. With lower level learners, you could adapt and modify the language you give them, so there's maybe only one or two uses, or two or three of the uses. This covers just about most. Still continues. Still plus a period of time and distance tends to have it associated, but maybe the meaning is a bit more remaining. Still, despite and nevertheless. Now, I think some of you were sort of mentioning that. It was tiring, but still fun. It rained and rained and rained and rained. Still, things could be worse. It was still, sorry, there's been a bit of slip there. It was still more positive than negative, even though, nevertheless, despite. That's a very, very, very common use of still in English, but not one that I think is really a sort of hardcore part of the ELT syllabus, I don't think. But it's a very, very common, particularly in more informal context, conversational language. Okay. Comparative adjective and still, similar meaning to even. Prices could go even higher, higher still. This one's even better, better still. Again, even tends to be in the higher end of the ELT syllabus, still tends not to be. But it's very useful and very common, and if we did a comparison of even higher and higher still, it would be very interesting if we looked at frequency. Still, which is the one you said at the beginning, stand still, the streets were completely still, in the still blue sea without meaning. Still hyphen plus adjective, still to be resolved, still active volcano, stillness in cockpit. Okay, so that's a little illustration of a bit of inductive learning where you look at the language yourselves, you pull out, you notice patterns, and you formulate rules yourselves. As I say, that's something that I actually do with my higher level learners at the university. Maybe it's something that you could do with your learners, and as I said, you can reduce the different language exponents in there according to the level of the learners. Okay, we can do some follow-up practice. Very simple, more conventional exercise. Add still, and again, this just then consolidates and revises, reviews the uses. There are still a few weeks to go. It was expensive. Still, it was very nice. They say prices will go higher still, and so on and so on. And then we can add a nice personalization stage. What could the sentences be referring to? There are still a few weeks to go until the end of term. It was very expensive. Still, it was very nice. The restaurant I went to last night. Okay, and so on and so on. So that's something that we can do with a bit of to practice the concept of inductive learning and a way of teaching some of these little words that perhaps are difficult to explain when a student says, what does still mean, for example. Okay, so let's move on. Published DLT material. This photograph I took a couple of days ago. It happens to be the first books that I reached for to my left here. Oxford EAP, actually I am co-author of that, a new EAP book. We've got English File and Headway, which I think a lot of you were mentioning at the beginning. Okay, so I use English File and I love it. Nico, does English File follow mainly a deductive or an inductive grammar approach? And for the rest of you, can you think about the books that you use in terms of its grammar teaching? Is it mainly inductive or deductive, or you're not sure, or a combination? Marianne, Headway, deductive. Okay. If you have a book next to you, maybe you can have a quick look. English File is really good, but is it inductive or deductive? A combination. Inductive, Branko, which book would that be? Murphy, inductive. Interesting. I think Murphy sort of gives you the rules and then practices in it more for consolidation. I think it's both. Yes, interesting, Nicola. I'm actually writing some grammar reference for a course book at the moment, and you're correct. In the body of the book, it often is inductive, and then you have the grammar reference section at the end, which gives the rules and maybe still has further practice. So yes, inductive and deductive at the end, which I think is a very good thing, because for those where the inductive process doesn't work, you've always got the deductive to focus on. Okay. English File is very good. Yes, a lot of people are saying that. Yeah, I'm sure it is. Yes. Is it inductive or deductive? I'm not actually sure. I haven't used English File for a while. A combination. Okay. Okay, let's have a look at some of you mentioned Headway. On the right is Headway, elementary, and on the left is Q Skills for Success. Very quickly, Q Skills and Headway, which is inductive, which is deductive? Can you put in the chat box? Headway, inductive. Yes. Left, deductive. Yes, exactly. As we can see, Q Skills it just gives the rules. This is maybe a bit more like the back of the book language references that we were just talking about a few minutes ago. So this is the same language area. Comparatives, it's elementary level, level 3 for Q Skills. Q Skills, the series style of Q Skills is very deductive. You turn the page, there are your rules. Headway is a classic case, and I'm not sure whether it's every single exercise, whether it is rigid, fixed series style or not, but this is certainly a classic case of inductive learning. Headway, oldie goldie, golden oldie. Yes, I think Headway was new when I started teaching. Which do you prefer, Linda or Paris? So there's a dialogue for you to engage with. There's your illustration. Practice the language, what are the difference? There's your engagement and you're starting to interact. Then the grammar spot, which is very inductive, but it's inductive with this intervention. Remember the intervention stage, the guidance, the hints, leading you. What are the rules? When do we add ER? When do we use more? And so on and so on. And then exercise 2, what are the comparative forms of the adjectives? That's sort of consolidating the induction, isn't it? That's the sort of initial check that you've got the rule. So that's a classic case of inductive teaching. It's a classic case of the 4 I's, and it's a classic illustration of this intervention stage, this guided discovery, if you like, this leading you towards the correct answer. Okay, we'll look at a couple more examples in a moment, but interestingly, this is the next page. Inductive is better for those already introduced to grammar, Hannah. Yes, I think so. We'll talk about the pros and the cons and the considerations shortly. Okay. as we can see here, this is the next page. The exercises that you practice are essentially the same kinds of exercises. So whether it's deductive or inductive, you sort of end up doing the practice, which often can be quite similar. And I think these two exercises are very similar. Two things, compare them, use the adjective given. Okay, and so on and so on. Okay, so I think somebody earlier on was saying headway was deductive. I don't know, maybe it has deductive elements. I know it has its language reference at the back, which certainly is deductive, its language explanations. Whether it's inductive as series style, maybe someone out there knows, or whether it mixes it up, I'm not sure. Okay. Here's another one. This is actually from Oxford EAP B1. And again, Q skills, and another illustration. Now, somebody mentioned, in fact, Hannah, your comment's still there. It's better for those already introduced to English grammar. There's a feeling that you need to have a certain minimum level, a higher level. However, this is pretty low level. Compound sentences. Again, Q skills on the left. Very deductive. This is the rule. Here are the rules. Here are the words we use. Oxford EAP, which is series style. Engagement with the text. There's your illustration, your interaction. Identify the difference between these sentences and simple sentences. In the previous section, they'd looked at simple sentences. Then gives you the rule after you've identified it yourself, hopefully. And then it goes to a little bit more inductive, just asking you to finalize the rules, to consolidate the rules, rather than them being given. And as you can see here, the practice exercises at the bottom are pretty identical. Join the two halves with a coordinating, using a coordinator, and, but, or. Okay. Can inductive learning work with A1 level students? I think it depends, Stephen. I think these are the considerations we'll talk about later. There are lots of factors. I think it possibly can if you're very careful with your presentation of the language, your illustration, if you're asking them to produce, for example, the plural S. Theory says that plural S is one of the easiest grammar rules in English to learn. It's very salient. It's quite obvious. There are very, very, very few exceptions to it. So maybe something as basic as plural S you could do deductively. Maybe you'd have to use some of your L1 to help them along the way. I don't know. Anyway, we'll talk about the pros and the cons and the considerations later. So there's another example. Okay, I'm going to get you to do a little bit more inductive learning, or if it's not learning, consolidation. What do we mean by hedging in a linguistic sense? What is hedging? Anyone like to put that in the box? Planting. Covering risks. Yes. Hedging. Let's have a few more ideas. Being indirect. Yes. It appears to be, exactly, that's a nice example of an exponent of hedging. It appears to be the case that. Okay. A couple more ideas of what is hedging? Apparently could be a form of hedging. Not upfront answers. Protecting students from risk of failure. Separate with bushes. Yes, okay, yes. Tentative language. Putting up fences, yeah, we can think of, I've seen a talk on hedging where the presenter started with a picture of a hedge and drew a parallel, that a hedge is putting a bit of a barrier between people, between ideas. Hedging is when we, softening language, exactly, when we want to avoid saying something too directly, we want to avoid being too black and white, we want to cover ourselves. Hedging is pretty central to a lot of academic language, particularly in the arts, more so than in the sciences, as a generalization. Hedging, yes, is when we don't want to say something too directly. We want to maybe cover ourselves. And we had a couple of examples here, I think, if I can go back up. It appears to be, is a nice example of hedging language. Okay, So let's do another little bit of inductive learning. Can you find examples of hedging language in this text? So we've moved from a corpus to a text. And can you put the hedging language that you have identified into two broad categories, two types? Can you divide them into two categories in some way? Okay, I'll leave you for a minute or so to have a look at that. Good, indicate thought to be. It is possible, yep. It is likely, okay, yeah, we've suggest, so we're finding the language. Were thought, okay, or always thought. Can you now maybe see if you can put them into two categories? Two different sort of grammar forms, if you like. Passive, possibly. I think there's only one example. Well, yes, passive. Yeah, you can analyze it from an active-passive point of view. That's not what I'm thinking, but you could go down that route. Okay, so we found the language. That's great. I didn't notice anyone saying points to. That's sort of classic hedging language, particularly in academic. It is structure, Irene. Great. Yes, we've got the it is structure. So Irene and Stephen, between you, yeah, the it is structure and the single word verbs. Okay. So that's another way of using a text. This is an EAP context, and we can then end up exactly as you two just said, and more of you. We can hedge with individual verbs. Now here we haven't differentiated between active and passive. You could approach it from that level of analysis. We chose not to. And the it, that, probable, possible, likely, unlikely, and so on and so on. Okay, so that's another example of how we can learn inductively and try and induce the learners with a bit of intervention to produce some patterns and some rules. Okay, whether that's a better way than just giving it to them in the style of Q skills, I don't know. This is what we'll talk about. You can hedge with other things as well. There are lots of other hedging devices. As you can see, this says hedging 1. I think hedging 2 looks at the classic hedging verbs seem and appear. But yeah, there are lots of processes of hedging, some very subtle ones, as well as some classic, easily identifiable ones, such as this. And then we can do some practice exercises. Again, whether you give the rules or you induce the rules, you can then do some classic, yeah, modal verbs might make code for hedging as well. Okay, it is thought that, it is likely that, research suggests, indicates, and so on and so on. Okay, we won't do this exercise, but that's the kind of exercise you can then do to help consolidate. Okay. Perspective, we'll not look at this, but this is another thing you can do, again, in an EAP context. Get the students to look at ways of discussing perspective, mentioning perspective, introducing perspective. And again, there's a big text. And again, we've got lots of examples. And again, through a similar process, you can add verbs from a perspective, point of view, from a, and so on and so on. So there's lots of things you can do, not just in the EAP context, but in a more general English context as well, as we looked at with the comparatives. So, pros and cons. Would anyone like to throw some pros and cons out there? Pros of inductive, cons of inductive. Engaging, I presume that's a pro of inductive approach, I'm guessing. Okay. Yes, Magda? Yes. Inductive thinking more in the beginning. Yes, perhaps. You're more active in the process rather than being receptive. Much less fun with deductive. Great, great. If you think you can have fun with language, and I think we can, fantastic. Takes more time. I presume you mean deductive, Sylvia. sorry, inductive, sorry, yes, deductive is often a bit quicker. Inductive cons, certain linguistic knowledge necessary. Yes, you need linguistic knowledge, Marianne, and you also, I think, need the language to be able to explain the language as well. Deductive is boring, can be. Students can analyze. Okay. It's a kind of brainstorming. Yep. Deductive when you have to clarify. Yeah, maybe we can use deductive as backup clarification after the inductive process, perhaps. More practice and thinking, fewer rules, enhancing thinking. Yes, Tatiana, I think on a more learner autonomy, learner development stage, I think we're helping our learners a lot. Inductive difficult for low level. Yes, as a generalization, but as we said, you know, there are lower, simpler structures we can teach at a lower level. Deductive appeals to more traditional, very possibly. I think it does depend on the learner's learning style. And to suddenly have to change could have negative backwash, could not be such a great thing. Discovery may produce more effective learning process. Deductive better for longer. Yes. Okay. Yeah. I think there are pros and there are cons. I suspect if I ask you now in a word, if possible, would you favour inductive or deductive? Both. Inductive, both. Inductive, yes. Both. Yes. I think what you're saying here, I think probably just sums it up. Inductive, ideally, perhaps, both is a reality. Okay. So, requirements for inductive approach. We need salient features. We need clear, our illustration needs to be clear. We need clear, regular patterns, simplicity of use, simple patterns, regular patterns, clearly identifiable patterns. So something like the ER and the more for comparative adjectives are quite salient features. It's quite regular use. Something like the plural S, again, regular use. Can you think of any grammar points that would not really be appropriate for inductive teaching because the features are not salient, because there isn't much simplicity of use and form or consistency? Can you think of any that you probably couldn't teach inductively or would be difficult? Adverbs of frequency, idioms, collocations, yes. The passive, yeah, I think a lot of passive in course books they do follow an inductive approach, but the intervention stage is very strong, I think. Present perfect, yes, ooh, the present perfect, fascinating aspect, but would be difficult perhaps. Countable, uncountable, yeah, you'd need a few leaps of faith, I think, a bit of lateral thinking, but I think, Robert, countable, uncountable with a lot of intervention, a lot of possibly. Okay, conditionals. What about articles? Inductive, yes or no? Ah, Philip, did you write articles just as I said that, or? A lot of yeses. Are these yeses for inductive? Interesting. There is theory within the ELT teaching world that perhaps we shouldn't really even teach articles. There are so many rules within rules and sub-rules within sub-rules and contradictions and individual uses that it's very difficult to teach, and we maybe should just let the learners acquire them. I personally disagree. I think we need to do a bit of teaching and alert the learners to the fact that there are all these sub-uses and sub-rules and so on. But I think teaching articles is perhaps something best done deductively, maybe. But if it can be done deductively, great. We mentioned a few minutes ago the metalinguistic tools. I think somebody said lower level learners don't have the linguistic knowledge. That's true. You need the linguistic knowledge on which to build the new language rules. You also need the language to be able to talk about it, and that's a factor. Talking about the comparatives more in ER is quite straightforward, but we mentioned articles. Talking about the rules of articles requires a lot of meta-language, which could make it impossible or very difficult. So here are some key factors. Okay, what do you think are different ground points deductively? Rachel, is that capital letter in U aimed at me? Maybe. Articles, I think, for one. But yeah, I mean, anything that's where doesn't satisfy these features, I think. But I think articles is a classic case, but it perhaps could be done. Okay, anyway, let's move on. I can maybe think about that and produce a list. Articles, why articles? Because I think they're not very salient. It's not very salient, really. You know, the reason for the articles is grounded in context. It's grounded in cohesion and reference within the text. It's grounded in exaphoric understanding, which is your understanding outside the text, you know, whether you use an article or not, and by text I mean spoken or written. There's a lot behind why we use which article when. So Daniel, that's a very good question, and we could do a whole session on articles, but I think that would be my initial answer to that, and the exceptions to the rules, phrasal verbs and so on. Okay, let's move on. Okay, pros of inductive approach. I think we spoke about some of these. It's very student-centered, the students are involved. It encourages noticing, which I think is a very useful skill, helping with learner autonomy, helping to develop the learner's learning. You know, if we can encourage them like we did with the text on hedging and like we did with the corpus extract, you know, if students can start to notice patterns, notice uses, I think we're doing them a great service. Involves the students, perhaps in theory gives a fuller understanding of the language, more memorable, increased motivation perhaps, a deeper level of processing, a sense of achievement perhaps. And again, all these things together can maybe foster learner autonomy. Anything else to add there? Robert, how you define noticing? Yes, I mean, firstly, there are some experts on noticing. There are some academics and linguists out there whose thing is noticing. So I'm sure if you Google around, you can find a better answer than I can give you. Maybe someone else would like to give an answer here. Noticing, I think literally in the simple sense, is noticing patterns and language, noticing how it would fit in with your interlanguage, noticing there's something that is a gap in your own language, and sort of making sense of it and fitting it in there. I think in the simple sense it is noticing bits of language that you perhaps weren't aware of, and beginning to incorporate it into your language. But as I said, there's some experts out there, so maybe a Google will help that, or maybe someone else can answer that here. Okay, cons. What did we say were the cons of the inductive approach? Time, slower, exactly, and there's the number one point. Time and energy consuming, exactly. Some teaching situations you have the luxury of having the time, others you don't. It's demanding of the teacher and the learner. Requires an experienced teachers, yes, perhaps the teacher needs maybe a little more grammatical understanding and knowledge. Magda, yes? The learner may arrive at an incorrect inference, incorrect or incomplete rule, which could have very negative consequences, negative backwash on the whole process. This is where the intervention stage, the guidance, if it's in a course book or by the teacher, is absolutely, has to be very careful that we almost ensure we get a correct rule. I think if you do a bit of try inductive teaching or learning and you get the rule completely wrong, it might put you off the inductive process for life. Frustrating if they can't get it exactly, yes. Can inductive learning be done as self-study? Possibly, if the material is very carefully staged, Stephen, and I think some self-study material does have, like the headway one, you know, the stages lead you to it. Often we do need us as teachers to sort of nudge the learners along. And I think somebody mentioned earlier again, it can conflict with preferred previous learning style. Okay, so we're coming to the end really. We're almost on the hour. I'd like to finish with a couple of quotes. Some agreement exists that the most effective grammar teaching includes some deductive and inductive. I think that, okay, Marianne, goodbye. I think we'll just be a couple more minutes. I think we would all agree, and I think we were saying it has to be both. Here's another quote I'll just quickly leave you to look at. Most evidence in community second language teaching points to the superiority of the inductive approach. I thought we had until 5. I think the session is through 5, Stephen, but my bit is about an hour long. Okay. Yes, so both those quotes basically saying it points to the superiority, the preference for an inductive approach where possible. And I think that's what we were saying. Now, Branka, who has, I've just checked, she's sadly had to leave the room to go teach. I asked her, and she posted me this. And I think this, I've left this to the end, and it's a real shame that she's had to leave. I think this is a nice summary of the it depends, yes and no, inductive ideally, but. I'll just leave you to read that, and just maybe you'd like to put a comment in the box. Do you identify with any of the comments that she makes? Yes, I think that there's some very good points here. It depends how you learn. She says she likes to have a pattern. However, she learned Portuguese by being with a group of Portuguese people for quite a while in an informal context. Then thought about the rules after she picked up the chunks. I like the way I teach is inductive, well, mainly. A nice afterthought there. This word depends. Some students need the rules, some are comfortable. Now you probably will get students in the same class on the same table, some who want you to tell them the rules, some who want to work it out for themselves, or they're happy to work it out for themselves. And at the end, if everything was served to them on a plate, then it's difficult to make them think. Again, I think that's a very good point. I think the inductive approach can help foster noticing, it can help foster learner autonomy, it can help the students to learn themselves. So I just thought this was a really nice little summary of the fact that we actually can't really, I don't think, draw a conclusion. So we'll finish there. It does sort of lead nicely onto the old Chinese proverb, or is it Greek or whatever. I think there's something of this in there. I know this is a bit of a cliche, but I think there's something in it, and I think this perhaps you know, is at the heart of the reasons why the inductive approach has developed over the decades. Okay. Fine. So we'll finish there. I hope that was interesting for you. I hope there was a little bit of food for thought. For those of you that were already familiar with the concepts, the approaches, I hope there was something that you can add to your understanding. And I hope you enjoyed having a little grammar chat for an hour. Okay, I will put the references up there for any of you who are interested in that. I shall just type in, I have a very simple website with a very simple address, johnhurd.com. If you would like to get in touch with me, there's a contact me page there. Any questions, comments, please, that will come directly to me. I'm very happy to receive your emails and your messages. Okay, if there are any burning questions, we have a few minutes, a little bit of time. So if there are any questions, put them in the box. I'm not sure whether Kate noted any that we can discuss, as she mentioned at the beginning. So anyway, if there are some questions, great. If not, thank you very much for coming, and I'll see you again somewhere. When will I have another seminar? I'm not sure, Nico. Okay, thanks, Rachel. Research into which is better, Robert. This is interesting. Not to my knowledge. I think it's very difficult to do quantitative or even qualitative research because there are so many variables. I think it's very difficult to produce research which is academically rigorous, which could result in deciding is one better than the other. There are also ethical issues as well. As you may know, we can't do research which exposes people to a process which we think is not as good as or is not as beneficial for them, or has more negative effect than the other group. That's one of the core ethics of academic research. So if you are thinking, you'd have to approach it from a very careful footing. But I just think maybe there is some research, Robert. Perhaps I'll have a little look around. But I just think there are so many variables, as we said, it would be difficult to be academically rigorous on that, I think. But maybe there's an opening there. johnhurd.com, exactly, Hannah. Yeah, it's a very simple website, but as I said, you can look at what I do, who I am, and you can contact me. Yeah, that will come directly to me. Okay. What about reflexive pronouns? Yeah, I presume you mean could they be taught inductively? I think possibly they could, because off the top of my head I think there's a regularity and there's a consistency of form. There are a few variations on syntax, but I think if your illustration stage was carefully thought through, I think reflexive pronouns possibly could be taught inductively, if that's what you mean, Eleanor Theodora. No sound. Okay, Nico, hope to see you at the next one. Best wishes from Transylvania. I was in Cluj not so long ago. Is inductive teaching better with a written or an audio text? I think you could try it with both. I think irrespective of I think whether it's inductive or deductive, I think the written, because it's a static text rather than audio, which is very transient, it's momentary, I think written is therefore easier to do analysis of. The word grammar originally came from, just to digress, Stephen, the word grammar originally came from the art of writing. Grammar was only a discipline, a field, once the language was written, because while it was spoken, it wasn't static enough to be analysed. So grammar comes from the Greek grammatica, which loosely translates to the art of writing. So we've digressed there a little bit, but I think analysis of language is far easier from a static written form than audio. But if you've got a nice, simple, straightforward audio, it could work as well. Yes, Robert, the AP book is a series, Oxford EAP. I co-wrote the B1 level, which just came out. The language, we haven't called it grammar, but the language analysis, the academic language section, which is essentially grammar, yes, it's essentially inductive. There's an inductive element to it, but there's a strong intervention stage. It guides you to it. It is B1, but yes, I think there are maybe some bits where we are deductive and we give the rule, but on the whole, if I remember rightly, it's essentially inductive. Bye, Magda. Stephen, I think it is. I think it is, but I think if we're mindful of what might work when, what works with our students, I think we can make the most, the best of both approaches. Okay. Yeah, there's no specific pattern. I think each of us are unique teachers. The way we teach is unique to each of us. There are broad patterns, there are broad approaches that we can fit into, but I think everything is a combination of things. I agree. And students' needs are unique, and as we have said, students' favoured approaches as well. Yeah. Okay, thank you, Stephen. Malwinia, Kate will talk to you in a minute. I'm not sure whether the certificate. Kate will be with you in one moment. And can I also take this opportunity to say thank you to Kate as well for moderating this, as well as thank you to all of you for being here. And maybe that's an appropriate point, Kate, if you're there to step in.
Hi.
Okay, bye everybody,
John,
thank you.
that was fantastic. That was a really brilliant webinar, and I can see from all the feedback and the comments that people are leaving that that was really well received, very thought-provoking, some really good questions asked with really comprehensive answers. So I think a very, very well done to you. Big round of applause from me and from everybody, I think. Amalia, the session was open from 3:30 to 5 to allow John to have his question and answer session at the end. But John's presentation was its length, and I think that he covered an awful lot of ground. That was, as I said, I thought it was incredibly comprehensive and really, really well delivered webinar. So thank you so much. And thank you everybody for attending today. I think that we've all benefited from it and taken something away. And I'm going to ask you once more, when you receive your follow-up email, which you will do, to please fill out the feedback. I think all these positive comments that are coming through, it would be really lovely for John to receive them through the feedback. So please do take the 5 minutes to fill out that form for us. You were asking about webinars. I can't tell you when John's next webinar will be, but if you'd like to keep an eye on the events page, it's oup.com/ELT/events, and you can see all the upcoming webinars on there. And just feel free to sign up to whichever ones you think might be applicable to you. And like I say, again, with the feedback form, it's really helpful for us to know what it is that you want to hear about, and if you think the content that you're receiving is valuable, because obviously these webinars are something that we provide for you. So please do have a look on there and see what you think, and fill in your feedback forms, and we'll try to keep our standards of webinars as high as they were today. So just a couple of last things from me. You will all receive a follow-up email from this webinar, just including a recording to the link, so you'll be able to watch this again and pick up on anything you might have missed. As I mentioned before, and one last plug, a request for feedback. There will also be a summary handout, and I do believe there will be a certificate for this webinar. But if you've got any questions about that, or if you don't receive your follow-up email, please do write to this email address. It's professionaldevelopmentservices@oup.com, and they'll be able to answer any queries that you might have. So just so that everybody knows how to get out of the webinar room, it's quite simple. You just go to Help and then Leave Session, and that will take you out of the webinar. I think it also works if you just close the window down, But there we go, that's how to do that. One last time,